Welcome to TheKillFile, your favorite true crime podcast. I'm your host, Brittany Spears. Each week, we will explore the dark corners of true crime, unsolved mysteries, and murder. Join me as we uncover secrets, investigate evidence, and dive into the chilling details of some of the most fascinating cases. Get ready for a journey into the dark unknown because, in TheKillFile, nothing stays buried forever. Hey guys, welcome to episode 51 of TheKillFile. I'm so glad that you guys are back for another true crime case today. Before we jump into today's episode, just a few quick reminders. The bonus content that we'll be rolling out this fall is going to be called Hidden Files. And on it, we will cover different true crime cases like assassination cases, natural disasters, some listener files, and more. So, if you are interested in having your own true crime story possibly read on the Hidden Files, email the story with the subject line of listener files to thekillfilepodcast@gmail.com. These can be anything from like a hometown murder that you remember, maybe the one that actually got you interested in true crime. It can be any crime that you had witnessed or your mom maybe witnessed and casually just dropped in your lap one day. Anything that is worth sharing with other listeners. Also, don't forget to check out the website at thekillfile.com and click Shop Merch if you're looking for some fun true crime merch. We add new things all the time. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to The Kill File. It is the absolute best way to help the podcast. That is free to my listeners and to get the word out there for other people to find. If nothing else, I would love it if you guys would find someone to share the podcast with that you think may like it. And or just share it on your social media and follow us on TikTok, Blue Sky, X, Insta, and our Facebook page. I upload every week and am getting better, I promise, at putting extra pictures and info on there. I am only one person and the podcast takes a lot of time and effort, but I'm doing my best. Okay, that's it for business. Let's talk about today's case. Today we're going to talk about the vampire or werewolf or butcher of Hanover. Trigger warnings for today are going to be murder, brutality, talks of murder on a minor, sexual assault on a minor, dismemberment, and cannibalism. Here we go. The year is 1924. The place is Hanover, Germany, more specifically, the Weimar Republic. Two kids are playing on the banks of the Leine River when they would find something completely unexpected. The things that nightmares are made of, a human skull. Just 1 week later, another skull would be found. At the time, authorities had thought that it could be a macabre humor of some local medical students. The next month, there would be more skulls found floating towards the shores of the Leine River, and this is when it was said more children would find a sack, and inside, pieces of human bone. After this, the police figured this was no joke. There was something terribly wrong here. The authorities closed the banks of the river and then proceeded to dredge it. After it was all said and done, there would be found over 500 human bone fragments found. It wouldn't take the authorities long to figure out the monster who was behind all of these bones found was a man named Fritz Haarmann. So, who was Fritz Haarmann? Friedrich Heinrich Karl Haarmann was born on October 25th, 1879 to Joanna and Ollie Haarmann. Fritz was the youngest of 6 children, and while it was known that Joanna was a doting mother to her children, Ollie was said to be less than so. He was allegedly an argumentative, short-tempered drunk who worked on the railroad. According to one source, Joanna had to be bedridden after she had given birth to Fritz, who was the apple of her eye. Sadly, Joanna was described as a frail woman, and it was apparently known that she was not extremely bright, although some sources said it much ruder, and I didn't like that. When Fritz was 7 years old and attending school, he was said to be a bit of a loner, quite introverted, and although he was a well-behaved child, he wasn't very good in the academic area. Fritz later on in his life would claim to have been molested by a teacher when he was just 8 years old. One source would also say that from a young age, Fritz had been fascinated with knives. In fact, he would hang around butchers and watch them cut up various meats. Fritz apparently liked to dress up in his sister's dresses at home, and he was also said to have loved to play with their dolls, which didn't bother his mother at all, but of course, royally pissed off his father. I know there are some parents out there that still get pissed about this kind of stuff, and it just makes me so fucking mad. We're all trying to break free of the gender roles that were forced upon us, and seeing the results of quote-unquote men not being allowed to show their softer side or sensitive side, which went right alongside the whole women shouldn't be allowed to be this or that, and yet some people still force this shit upon their children. Who gives a flying fuck what your child likes to play with? Fun fact, when my family moved here to KC from Colorado in 2018, I couldn't find any preschools here. Like, they had daycares, but not like actual preschools. And when I would call these quote-unquote schools, trying to find my son a school here that was comparable to his in Colorado, it was impossible. It was like they had full-time or half-time daycare. Finally, we found a preschool at a church close by, actually just a block over, and although we are non-believers, we figured that it was just the place where they kind of held the school. We didn't realize the shit that they were going to force upon my son, like praying and God talk. That was a fun surprise. Anyways, the day that we went in for orientation, my son was upset because they only had dresses for girls to dress up in, and they didn't have anything for the boys to dress up in and play. So, being the person that I am, I told my son to put on a dress if he wanted, and that dress-up clothes were for anyone, but that it was totally up to him. Well, proud mom moment, because in that moment, my baby said, "Fuck everyone else," and put the dress on to play in. And it sadly only lasted a few minutes because the entire room was basically staring at him, which pissed me the fuck off, but I was so proud of him for not giving two shits and doing what he wanted. He's still that way to this day, and needless to say, I had to speak with his teacher a few times about some little girls being assholes and not letting my son play in the little kitchen area, telling him that it was only for girls. Fuck that. People, especially children, in my own opinion, should be allowed to play with whatever the fuck they want, and everyone deserves the chance to dress up as children and play make-believe. Fuck what anyone else thinks. Anyways, back to the story. So, when Fritz was 15 years old, his dad wanted to quote-unquote toughen him up, and this is when he would send his son to military school in Breisach, Germany. Apparently, Fritz and his father were constantly at each other's throats. Ollie would threaten to send Fritz to an asylum, and Fritz would threaten to expose his father for an alleged murder he had committed of a train conductor. Although it was said that Fritz actually did enjoy his time at military school and was said to be a good soldier, he was ultimately sent back home with some health or mental health issues at the time. His diagnosis was called anxiety neurosis, but later on he would actually be diagnosed with epilepsy. After this, Fritz went to work in his father's factory, which produced cigars. So I'm not exactly sure if the father stopped being a railroad worker and bought a cigar factory, or if his father worked at the cigar factory now, but either way, it was here that Fritz began to show signs of what he would later become. Fritz would lure boys to different areas of the factory that were isolated and began to abuse the boys. This is something that he would actually be arrested for. After he was arrested, there would be a psychiatric evaluation done on Fritz by a man named Gert Schmelfus. Great name. And this would lead to Fritz being certified as, quote, incurably deranged. This meant that he was unfit to stand trial and would be detained to a mental asylum indefinitely. Fritz at this time was barely over the age of 18. One source went on to say that Fritz suffered severe trauma at the asylum, which I can only imagine. Only 7 months into his stay at the asylum, he would escape, and his mother would aid her son in fleeing to Switzerland. I couldn't help but think here, like, what would you do? Would you help your son or daughter escape after leaving an abusive asylum? I can only imagine if your child tells you the horrors that's happening to them at this asylum, that it would be hard to force them to stay or call the authorities on your own child. What would you do? I feel like I would force my child to live with me so that I could keep a good eye on them if they were mentally unwell, and I would just kind of threaten to send them back if they did anything or tried to move away, but I don't know. Later on, Fritz would be quoted as saying, quote, "Hang me, do anything you like to me, but don't take me back to the loony bin," end quote. If he's asking for death over the asylum, it's gotta be pretty bad, right? After Fritz's move to Switzerland, he would start to date a woman named Erna Leuert, who, after some time, would end up pregnant, and then, of course, the couple would end up engaged. I say of course because of the times. The betrothed couple was in for an unexpected surprise when the military would come to claim Fritz for his mandatory service, and this was late into 1900. Later on, Fritz would say that this was the happiest time in his life. One day during exercise, Fritz collapsed, and because of this, he was taken to the hospital where he would end up staying for 4 months, where they would then diagnose him with dementia praecox, which is no longer used and is now outdated. The replacing diagnosis for this is now schizophrenia. So I did a little research into what would be used as a treatment in Germany in 1900 for dementia praecox, and where it came from. According to the Encyclopedia of Schizophrenia and Other Psychotic Disorders written by Richard Knoll, because they didn't know exactly what caused dementia praecox, they didn't really know how to treat it. and they couldn't make any specific treatments for it. So sometimes the patient was institutionalized, sometimes there were drugs used like barbiturates and opiates, and when there was an acute episode of distress, a nice long bath was used to treat it. Emil Kraepelin, the man who really coined this diagnosis and was known to have researched patterns in patients and write his own textbooks, was actually known to have dabbled in hypnosis for the patients as well, but with no real luck. Can you imagine that the best quote-unquote treatment for this severe mental illness was not only drugs, which we have seen in true crime many times does not help mental health issues if they are not for that specific disorder, but that baths were the best that they could come up with? That's awful. After some research into what barbiturates are, they apparently have been discontinued, and in its place, benzodiazepines are used. According to the National Library of Medicine, barbiturates are categorized as a sedative hypnotic medication that was used for treating neonatal withdrawal, which is when babies are introduced to certain drugs in the womb, and this barbiturate would help keep them from dying when they're born and no longer have that drug. They were used for preoperative anxiety, insomnia, seizure disorders, and even for putting people into comas when it was needed to relieve pressure in the brain. When I further research into what barbiturates do to a person as far as a side effect or why they're not used, I read that they are extremely addicting. In fact, it was stated from the Freedom Center, which is an addiction treatment company, that barbiturates used at its peak around the 1950s because it was sort of like the go-to drug and it treated everything. Over 250,000 Americans were addicted to them, and thousands had already died from overdoses. In fact, it is believed that Miss Marilyn Monroe may have overdosed on barbiturates themselves. Some side effects from barbiturates include rashes, sedation, nausea, hypotension, which is low blood pressure, headaches, confusion, drowsiness, and even hallucinations. I can imagine that someone with schizophrenia who probably already has so many issues would suffer from some things being worse with this kind of treatment. I couldn't find what Fritz was treated with, but looking into what Germany would have done or tried to do to people with mental illness in a quote-unquote lunatic asylum, I can imagine it was pretty bad and didn't exactly help Fritz, which is probably why he escaped the first time and went to Switzerland. When Fritz arrived back to Hanover, he again was working at the cigar factory and was continuing his relation with Erna. Somewhere around this time period, Ollie, Fritz's father, would accuse him of trying to kill him. Apparently, Ollie tried to have his son recommitted back to the asylum, but the local doctor said that he was just quote-unquote morally inferior and released Fritz. It was said that in an effort to possibly bury the hatchet and to maybe help his son move on in life, Ollie helped Fritz open a fishmongery with Erna. So I had to look up what this was because I figured it out of context, but I wanted to make sure that I knew what it was so I wasn't wrong and putting out wrong information. But a fishmonger is someone who sells fish, so I'm guessing that a fishmongery is the store itself. Correct me if I'm wrong. Fritz would end up accusing his fiancée of cheating in a fit of rage, and I guess Erna had had enough of his bullshit because the business was in her name. She ended up kicking Fritz to the curb, where he would end up alone. I was kind of curious why the father would put the business in her name. Maybe it's because Fritz was running from the asylum or because he had been in trouble in Hanover or whatever, but lucky for her because she was pregnant as well, so now she would have income. After this, Fritz had a hard time holding down a job because of his struggling mental health. He then became a con man, a thief, and would embezzle money because his military pension was not enough to support himself on. In 1914, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison for stealing from a warehouse. After Fritz was released in 1918, he then joined what was said to be a smuggling ring, as well as becoming a spy for the police. One source said political spy, but most sources just said police informant. And of course, he kept up his ways of thievery as well. At this time, Fritz was also, on occasion, in trouble for assaults or sexual offenses, although it should have been much more because the victims were too embarrassed or ashamed to tell the police. Many of the crimes went unreported. As World War I was ending, Fritz would escalate his crimes. In late September of 1918, there was a boy named Friedel Roth who had run away from his home and sadly was never heard from again. Somehow, Roth's father would find out that he had been friends with Fritz. I guess at the time, Fritz was taking boys of all ages back to his apartment to have some quote-unquote fun. During the time of Roth's disappearance, Fritz was a police informant, and it's assumed because of this, the authorities didn't really investigate Fritz when it was brought to their attention that he had a connection with Roth. However, after some time, the authorities did agree to go and check Fritz's apartment for any signs or clues that would lead to Roth's disappearance. When the authorities arrived, they would find Fritz in bed with a boy who was only 13 years old. Fritz was arrested and given at the time what seemed to be a slap on the wrist, charged with something called indecency with a minor. One source did say, though, that at the time there was kind of a lack of laws surrounding these circumstances. The authorities never even searched Fritz's apartment for anything related to Roth. Some speculated that maybe the authorities and those around just assumed that Roth had left on his own. Along with being an informant to the authorities, Fritz was also known as a quote-unquote black market butcher who sold meat at extremely low prices, and because of the post-war economy, people were poor and worried about how they were going to feed their families. It was said that because of the hard times that Germany was facing post-World War I, many people struggled to make ends meet and would end up sex workers in order to make extra money. At the time, both men and women were turning towards sex work. One source would say that many young men were seen hanging around a garden area near a place called Café Krop, seemingly for sex work. Unfortunately for these young men, the area they hung around was not far from Fritz's apartment. At this time, Hanover, Germany was considered the quote-unquote Sodom of Germany because of the type of people who showed up and stayed in Hanover. There were known to be criminals, abused and beaten down soldiers, vagrants, and of course, sex workers. Fritz did pretty well in this area with his black market meat. Somewhere along his journey, Fritz was said to pick up an accomplice of sorts, a sex worker named Hans Grans, who was about 20 years younger than Fritz. The pair was said to have spent a good 6 years living in the seedy part of town called the quote-unquote Ghost District. Fritz made a living with his meat, and then he would patrol the streets looking for homeless young men, sex workers, or runaways. It's reported that Fritz loved Grans and that Grans easily took advantage of this. He knew his quote-unquote mentor's twisted urges and was known to egg Fritz on and toy with him. Grans was said to be the smarter of the two and used it to manipulate Fritz. People in this area started noticing Fritz arriving at his apartment with all sorts of young men, and many were never seen again. The rumors were that he was selling them for money or maybe even butchering them, and that this was the meat that he was selling to the poor local families. I guess the butcher rumor was so strong that children around his residence made up a song about Fritz, which is just the creepiest thing that I have ever heard. It went like this. Wait just a while. Soon, Haarmann will come to you too. With the little cleaver, he'll make liver sausage out of you. Is that not awful? Oh, holy shit. Also, why are all the children's songs and stories that are created that we tell children some seriously fucked up content? Like London Bridges, Ring Around the Rosie, the story of Hansel and Gretel? Why do people tell children this shit? No wonder we are all morbidly curious. The rumors would eventually lead to two local women named Dorchen Brutig and Harman Ellie showing up to the police station in the middle of February 1923, wanting to ensure that the meat that Fritz was selling was indeed pork. I guess there was a German article written in something called The Focus Online that said these two women had suspected that Fritz had killed a young man that they saw with him, so they apparently snuck into his apartment where they found a bloodied apron and some meat in a pot. They then stole 2 pieces of the meat to take to the police to be tested. The authorities didn't believe the women, but they still made a doctor check the meat, who apparently laughed and said anyone could tell that these are pork rinds, but he did say he didn't have the ability to smell that day because he was sick. It was just 1 year later, the first skull would be found. The authorities believed that over 500 pieces of human bones belonged to over 22 murder victims. One source would say that approximately 30% of these fragments were from young men or teens aged 15 to 20 years old. Fritz was quickly looked at because of his history of being in trouble for molesting young men and boys. 2 undercover officers from Berlin were brought in because of the fact that Fritz was an informant. He knew many of the officers and would recognize them. The 2 undercover officers were posted at Hanover Station, where it was said that many young men were known to frequent and then vanish. This is also the place that Fritz was known to hang around. While the undercover officers were surveilling Fritz at Hanover Station, they saw him arguing with a 15-year-old boy named Keith Fromm. Fritz then went over to some officers that he did recognize and told them that they needed to arrest Keith because he had been traveling with fake documents. The authorities arrested Keith, but this would turn out to be a huge mistake. Keith then told the police while he was in custody that he had been staying with Fritz for many days now, and while he was staying there, Fritz had sexually assaulted the poor boy numerous times, and a lot of the time, this was at knife point. The very next day, they arrested Fritz and would proceed to search his apartment during the investigation. When they entered Fritz's apartment, they would find traces of blood on the mattress, the walls, and of course, the floors. When questioned about the evidence of blood in his apartment, Fritz told the authorities this was from the animals he butchered and admitted that he did sell meat on the black market. It must have sucked back then without any technology to find blood and truly not know if it was an animal or human blood. Like, what a roadblock to find blood and not be able to do a damn thing with it back then. Thankfully, in Fritz's apartment, the authorities would also find belongings and clothing that did not belong to Fritz. They took the items to the police station to display them and had locals come and identify the clothing if they could, which people did, and mostly the clothes were identified as young men or boys who had vanished. According to a translated article from the NDR website in Germany, even though they had clues to the fact that Fritz was guilty, they didn't have enough evidence to actually convict him of the crimes. Listen to what the police did to try and entice a confession out of this man. Quote, "The police resort to dubious and illegal methods. 4 skulls are mounted in the corner of Haarmann's cell. The eye sockets are covered with red paper, and a burning candle is placed behind them. A sack of bones is also placed in the corner of the cell. Haarmann is persuaded that the souls of the dead will come and claim him. He is also beaten during interrogations." End quote. The article goes on to say that none of this was known until well into the 90s when Herman Lang, a criminal inspector, wrote memoirs and spoke to this happening. Had this been known during the time of the actual Fritz Haarmann and Grans Hans investigation, they would have had to let the pair go, which would have been so stupid on their part. 44-year-old Fritz Haarmann, on July 1st of 1924, would actually confess to his crimes. Fritz went on to confess that while in a quote-unquote sexual frenzy, he had killed more than 20 young men. He then said he couldn't remember how many exactly, though. He called the young men that he had murdered, quote, puppet boys or doll boys, which was another word for sex workers out there. He said that he would entice them with offers of free food, where then he would usually have sex with them and proceed to bite them in the throat, saying, quote, "I'd bite into their Adam's apples," and then stated he drank their blood. Fritz then described how he systematically dismembered his victims' bodies. According to an article on Daily News, quote, "Haarmann would then methodically dismember the bodies, removing intestines, organs, and brains, legs, and arms, then stripping off all of the flesh, putting it in a bucket. The bones would be tossed out the window into the river. The flesh he made into sausages to sell on the street and to feed friends," end quote. Some sources would say it was heavily speculated that he used the meat as his black market meat, but then would say that it was never substantiated. Fritz also frequently sold the personal items of his victims as well, which is why he was also known as a second-hand dealer. Looking through his list of victims, because there are so many, and so many of them don't have a lot of details, again, because they are children, I will say that they seem to start in February of 1923, with the exception of Friedel Roth, which was in 1918. The killing lasted until June 14th of 1924, where his last victim, a 17-year-old boy named Eric de Vries, was killed, and later Fritz would take the authorities to his remains. So yes, this serial killer murdered, butchered, and drank the blood of over 20 victims in just over a year, which is absolutely insane. That's so many young men, and it's believed that there's more. In fact, when Fritz was asked, he estimated his victim total to be about 30 or 40 young men or boys, and then later increased the number further up into the 70s. Which makes me wonder if he didn't stop after Roth, that first killing in 1918, but rather wasn't killing as many at first. After Fritz was arrested and during his confessions, he told the authorities that during the quote-unquote search of his apartment, that never really took place after the disappearance of Friedel Roth, he actually had the severed head of the young man hiding it behind the stove, and it had been wrapped in paper. One source said during his confessions that he would take the authorities on a quote-unquote murder tour of where body parts and skeletons had been hidden. So not only were people in the area pissed when they found out that Fritz was a police informant during the time that he was a serial killer, but after everything was said and done, at least 8 people in the Hanover Police Department were fired. Now, during the time, the police wanted witnesses and family or friends of missing loved ones to come forward and try to identify numerous victims, but because of the sheer volume of his victims, it was hard to do this in an efficient way. The Hanover police then made a first of its kind in Germany's police force history, a film to show the details about Fritz Haarmann. The film wasn't super long, you can find it online, but it showed where Fritz sold his meat, where he was known to go for a drink. It also showed his apartment building and highlighted the area where Fritz's apartment was, and then it even showed the banks of the river where he was known to have dumped his human remains. It speculated that this film was probably shown in local theaters in Hanover. And because of this film, it was said that many people then headed to the police station to give their statements. Right before Fritz's trial, the film was banned. Police were only able to identify about 27 of his victims, sadly, and this is why during his trial he was actually only charged with the murders of 27 people. During the trial of Fritz Haarmann, and because this was a huge media story all over Germany, there were only allowed 80 extra people into the gallery. They actually sold tickets for a 1-hour viewing of the trial, and this was said to be a show. Women were said to have worn furs and nice things when they attended the trial, and there were reporters from all over the world, including some from Japan. Apparently, the bleached bones of the victims, as well as his bloody bucket, were on display at his trial for all to see. Fritz was said to have behaved badly and even smoked cigars during the proceedings. Many reported that Fritz showed no remorse and seemed to be indifferent towards his own actions. He even stated during trials while he was shown pictures of the victims that he couldn't remember their faces and would say in court that he probably killed this one or another. In a newspaper article from the Daily Mirror, Fritz seemed to be bored through the whole trial and multiple times was said to have asked for the death penalty, saying that he deserved to be beheaded. Fritz would also claim that even though he was guilty and had admitted to many of the murders, that the skulls that had been found in the river were not from his victims because he would crush the skulls of his victims before he would throw them in the river. Okay, now I saw a picture of Fritz Haarmann's apartment during my research and it looked like a small apartment. I know they found some blood on the walls and floor and mattress, but all I can think of was where did all of the gore go in his apartment after killing and dismembering his victims? There is so much blood in a human body, and we are talking so many victims. There's no way he would be able to do the cutting part in his apartment without getting a mess everywhere. Did he have tarps down like Dexter style? Did he drain them first? I have so many questions. Luckily for me, those questions were answered by one source who would say that Fritz, at one point during his trial, had said, quote, "I never intended to hurt those youngsters, but I knew that if I got going, something would happen, and that made me cry. I would throw myself on top of those boys and bite through the Adam's apple, throttling them at the same time. I'd make 2 cuts in the abdomen and put the intestines in a bucket, then soak up the blood and crush the bones until the shoulders broke. Now I could get the heart, lungs, and kidneys and chop them up and put them in my bucket. I'd take the flesh off the bones and put it in my wax cloth bag. It would take me 5 or 6 trips to take everything and throw it down the toilet or into the river. I always hated doing this, but I couldn't help it. My passion was so much stronger than the horror of cutting and chopping." End quote. He also explained he would feel guilty before cutting up the body and would place a rag over the face of the young men so they couldn't look at him. That right there tells me that he's not insane because he has some remorse, and psychopaths or sociopaths often don't feel, or struggle at least, with remorse. Hans Grons was on trial at the same time as Fritz after he was caught as his accomplice/lover. It was said that the pair had met back in 1919 while Fritz was in jail for theft and sexual assault. Fritz said that his lover had sort of egged him on in the killings. Allegedly, Grons encouraged him to kill one victim because Grons wanted the suit. It was said that Grons often took items or was given items from Fritz's murder victims. Grons denies knowing about the deeds of Fritz, but he had still been accused of introducing some of the victims to Fritz and then for taking or selling some of the personal items. Grans was found guilty of the crime of aiding and abetting murder, which would see him sentenced to death. In a weird twist, while Fritz was in prison, he was able to write a letter exonerating Grans, stating, quote, "Grans had absolutely no idea I was murdering, never saw anything," end quote, and this was tossed out of the window while he was being transported. Fritz was ordered to submit to a psychiatric evaluation that actually lasted 6 weeks, and this was not long before his trial started. Dr. Ernst Schultz said that Fritz was sane, and after this, it was no surprise that the jury would find Fritz Haarmann guilty of the 24 murders that were charged against him. He then stated he only incriminated his lover out of spite or revenge, and that they forced him to incriminate Grans during the interrogations. In 1926, the case against Hans Grans was reopened, where he was sentenced to life in prison, and then it was reduced, where he only had to serve 12 years for his complicit acts in the murderous crimes. Fritz Haarmann, at the end of his trial, asked to be beheaded, claiming that it would only take a moment, and then he would be at peace. Fuck that. Why does this sick fuck get to decide what he should get, and why does it get to be peaceful for him when he brutally killed his victims? He went on to say, quote, "I want to be executed on the Glagismark Square. On my grave is the inscription, 'Here rests the mass murderer Haarmann. On my birthday, Hans will come and lay a wreath,'" end quote. I don't like the satisfaction that this fucker is getting from knowing that he is going to die. Just 4 months after the 14-day trial had wrapped up, Fritz was beheaded on the morning of April 15th, 1925. After the guillotine came down upon his neck, Fritz Haarmann's head was sent to the research at the Brain Research Institute in Munich. It was said during this study that doctors figured out that he had meningitis. They believed this inflammation could have contributed to his murderous acts, but I beg to differ. And that, my friends, is the awful story of the vampire, werewolf, or butcher of Hanover, Fritz Haarmann. So there's been many books and actually a few movies written about Fritz Haarmann, but one thing that stuck out to me, and it's funny, not funny, but I guess there was some debate when back in 2007, a Hanover Advent calendar, which you know what Advent calendars are, right? Like those things that you give your children at Christmas that have like the countdown to Christmas on it, and you open those little flaps and you get like a piece of candy or chocolate every day until Christmas. And oh, I just loved them as a kid. Anyways, someone had the grand idea in Hanover to make one that had Wilhelm Busch, which was a German poet and artist who made things in the mid-1800s comparable to what I will say is like comics in a newspaper. A little drawing like accompanied by satire or quick-witted caption. Next to Wilhelm was a man named Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who was a famous German mathematician from the late 1600s, and next to Gottfried was good old Fritz Haarmann wielding an axe. I mean, no disrespect to any victims or family, and I am absolutely not making light of what this piece of shit did to young men, but whose grand idea was this to put him on the Advent calendar right alongside these amazing men? It is said the reactions have been mixed, although apparently the Hanover tourism services have received some threatening emails, and apparently they've all been called blasphemers. I saw the pictures. They're like cartoony with different scenes on them. I have a few, and I'm going to post pictures on the TheKillFile social medias, so watch for that. I guess as of even this year, Fritz Haarmann still appears in current Advent calendars, but now it's more discreet. It just kills me because on the one hand, it was a very long time ago and the people that were mostly affected by this monster are long gone. And it is a part of the history of this town. And we all love true crime. And you know, this group of people who keep putting him on the Advent calendar are definitely people like us. Which, by the way, I'm working on a name that we can call ourselves who are in our community besides true crime lovers. Something more geared towards TheKillFile listeners. But anyways. The other side of that is that I can totally understand it really pissing people off that the calendars have all of these amazing men on there from Germany, and then there is this horrible man who butchered all these people. Like, what the fuck? Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this fucked up tale as much as I did, and I hope to see you guys next week for another episode here on TheKillFile, where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye. All right, guys, that's going to do it for today. A few quick reminders before you go. Please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on your platform. It will help TheKillFile and other true crime lovers find us. Also, check out the website at thekillfile.com to suggest a case. Find our merch shop for fun KillFile gear, which you can also find at thekillfile.printify.me and help support the podcast. Have a suggestion or want to share your own true crime stories? Email TheKillFilePodcast@gmail.com for a chance to get them read on the podcast. Follow The Kill File on your favorite social media platforms. We are on Facebook, Instagram, X, Blue X, TikTok, and of course, you can subscribe on YouTube as well. Find all of the links for the socials on the website. We are either listed as The Kill File or The Kill File Podcast. Come on back Mondays wherever you get your podcast fix when we will cover another case here on The Kill File, where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye.